Thank you very much for the nice introduction and the invitation to speak to you here on this beautiful summer afternoon. Next slide, please. We know quite a few chemicals that have endocrine disrupting properties. We've heard already about DES. We have heard this afternoon about flame retardants, certain plasticizer chemicals, certain pesticides. Painkillers is probably a new one to you. Paracetamol has recently made headline news, at least in my country of residence. But despite all this advance in knowledge, there are huge knowledge gaps still about the full spectrum of endocrine disrupting chemicals we all come into contact with in our lives. Next, please. Steady, tiger. So what is necessary to regulate chemicals? And I observe this from a distance. There's still quite a lot of confusion about the difference between a definition, criteria, and all this. So let us begin with a definition. When you want to regulate a new group of chemicals, you need to first define what you want to regulate. That's the purpose of a definition, and in the case of endocrine disrupting chemicals, that is really not very controversial. Next, please. Then the next element is you need tests. Because having defined what you want to regulate, you then can move to tests which help you how to detect the chemicals you have just defined. And then finally, next, criteria are there to translate test outcomes into regulatory action. And there's a constant confusion in some people's minds about criteria and definition. Next. What is controversial at the moment, and that's the topic of debate, is the criteria. So the translation of test results into criteria for regulatory action for endocrine disrupting chemicals. Next. But my point to you this afternoon is that the overlooked big gap also concerns tests. Next slide. So we have heard a lot about anti-androgens, thyroid-disrupting chemicals, hormonal carcinogens. Next. They all act, and that's another area that's often confused by certain scientists even, they all act during specific windows of exposure in fetal life. Next. In adulthood, the spectrum of effects to be expected is totally different. So for example, I believe I'm a grown-up man, and to me an exposure to anti-androgens will have far fewer risks than to a developing male fetus in the womb. Here you see both the power of hormones and the important distinction of certain windows of exposure and certain windows of vulnerability. Next, please. But this is why endocrine disruptors are such a challenge. These specific windows of vulnerability that has long been overlooked in standard tests, and there's a very instructive, if you like, little history of the detection of phthalates as endocrine disruptors. Next, please. They were tested for years and years at the wrong time. Next, please. With too few animals, and they're therefore overlooked. And only when more appropriate tests were used came the endocrine disrupting properties of phthalates, these plasticizer chemicals, to light. Next, please. So we've also heard about the OECD, which does a good and essential job at validating endocrine disruptor test guidelines. If we want to operate with tests in the regulatory arena, they need to be validated. Next, please. But it is not fully appreciated and not fully understood that currently not a single OECD endocrine disruptor guideline is fully implemented in EU or US law. There are some indirect triggers, but the general picture is that most of these OECD endocrine disruptor tests are not implemented at all. Next, please. So you can picture this as an iceberg. above the tip of that iceberg is where we currently are. We're not even dealing with the tip of the iceberg, which is the current OECD conceptual framework. If you go below the waterline, you have a number of essays that are about to be validated and implemented and reviewed by OECD, and very deep down you have other receptors, pathways, and probably some essays developed and used as scientific tools, which could be validated and developed into proper essays. Next, please. So the consequence of this is that if, for example, you look at pesticide draft assessment reports, which are currently held by EFSA, you find very few data from relevant endocrine disruptor tests in there. The reason for that being the current guidelines for data requirements do not ask for endocrine disruptor tests. Next, please. So here's the dilemma. If there are few data from relevant tests, how can we assess the impact of future endocrine disruptor regulation properly? Next, please. So there are current lists of pesticides affected by endocrine disruptor cutoffs. They are circulating, these definitions of chemically endangered species. Certain pesticides are viewed as this. There's speculation they might fall under the cutoffs of the new plant protection product regulation. But these lists, they are developed by non-governmental organizations. They're developed also by competent authorities from certain member states. Their feature is they vary. Various authorities have second-guessed various pesticides. There's little agreement, but the mystery resolved is that these lists are based on indirect indication of endocrine disruption. They are not based on the proper OECD validated tests, simply because the data are not there, or at least not publicly available. Next, please. So these projections are largely, I would say, unreliable. Next, please. And this brings me to the current impact assessment exercise. The question arises how the European Commission will deal with this. How will it square this circle? The proper data are not yet available, at least not publicly, yet the Commission is asked and tasked with assessing the impact of various regulatory options on the realm, if you like, of endangered chemical species. Next, please. So the next question is, we all know the impact assessment is going on, and I think that's a personal guess I have here. I guess it will delay endocrine disruption regulation by 3, maybe 4 years. And the irony of this is also, and I'm not sure whether those that have lobbied for the impact assessment are fully aware of this, that for the duration of anything else, the interim criteria in the plant protection product regulation apply. And that means that any pesticide category 2 carcinogen, reproductive toxicant, and there's another alternative which I won't bore you with, will fall under the knife. Next, please. The question is, are the interim criteria actually implemented? That is the interesting question, which maybe we'll get an answer to this afternoon. Next one. My last point is this: we hear a lot about the chemical industry, who, from a power point of view and personal point of view, emotionally understandable perhaps, jump up and down a lot, and the pesticide industry in particular perhaps feel a little like with their backs against the wall. So you hear a lot of song and dance about certain fractions of industry in relation to endocrine disruptor regulation. But again, overlooked is the fact that other industries also show an interest in this, but in a slightly different way. For example, the reinsurance industry. These are the guys who, when there's litigation, they have to step up the money and pay for litigation costs, millions and millions of euros or dollars in the United States. The reinsurance industry views endocrine disruption as one of the big coming issues. The reinsurance industry sits mostly in Switzerland. So I just thought I'd throw this in to give a bit more of a varied picture. Industry is not a monolith, it's not a united front, and even industry has different interests in relation to endocrine disruption. Next one. So just to end my little presentation, just 39 seconds over with this little picture again, the WHO UNEP report, and I thank for your attention. Thanks very much.